Near future Earth. Nascent mega-corporation-based space exploration. Privatized espionage industry. Humanity encounters something unspeakable in the vast depth of space. Explore a moon light years away from Earth, with the research experiment gone wrong, and experience the cosmic horror for yourself in third person. Hi everyone. It's been a while since I did a video, and currently I paused development on my game that I spent most of 2023 on, and half of 24 maybe. And this is kind of an overview of what I did. I took some screenshots, and these are the sections I will be showing. The setting is, as you probably heard in the intro blurb, kind of cyberpunk, near future, space exploration, pretty moody, spooky atmosphere, mega corporations, that kind of stuff. So I did some sketches and a few renderings, and then I have a few screenshots here to see kind of how the initial concepts came out. And yeah, some other impressions and drawings I did early. I think the middle one was kind of a moment in development where I really felt that the style, the aesthetic was working, and the left one as well. That the gameplay and the environments can really express that feeling that I had in mind. And so with that, let's go to the character at first. So I will talk a bit about the character, the weapons, the game mechanics, what I had in mind. So this will be a typical view of the game. You can see you have your character in the currently aiming, so you can have the camera zoomed out, or when you hold down the button you would go into aiming mode, like a lot of third-person shooters do. And you have all the UI of the game, aside for this little crosshairs in the middle. It's all part of the environment. So the player character has indicators on his back, and some of those are duplicated and mirrored on the weapon. So this color, this turquoise, this teal color, is showing the mode of the weapon, and the little bot, companion bot, shows it here as well. And there's another mode, and you can see how many bullets you shot, and if you jumped, and so on. And more information is on this bot. And this is that character from the front, inside the player's ship. And here outside you can see this orange mode is the other one, so you have this teal mode and this orange mode. And I use those colors only in these places to clearly differentiate the modes and not confuse with other areas that don't have anything to do with that. These are the costumes, the player costumes. I started with the central one. That was the initial idea. I wanted an easy, simple shape that is recognizable, easy to draw, and has a reasonably strong silhouette. So to strengthen the silhouette, I made this very egg-shaped helmet, almost like from Alien, the head of the alien in Alien. And also added this kind of back module that has part of the UI as well. And later I adjusted this to also have a second version that has more armor and some wider pants. So basically the players can choose what they like. And since I already had those, I made a few different color variations. I quite like the white one. I think it looks pretty good as well. But the iconic one I wanted to be red, so that the main player would be red in all the main material. This is the model of the armored version in all 4 views and with a wireframe. So this is the low poly version that I modeled and rigged and animated, even though the animations are not that great, but I did them myself. These were the sketches. This central one was the initial idea. So you have those lines and those expanding rings as the motif, and a kind of simple shape, with the issue being, of course, that doesn't make for a particularly strong silhouette. So I added the helmet, kind of neck and helmet area, which had a more unique silhouette, and also some element on the back. So initially it was a wing, but later I shrunk that down a bit because it blocked the view. And you can see certain details here, what I had in mind, and then a sketch of the armored version on the right. Then the next part is the guns. So I didn't want to focus too much on weapons, but I do think I have a clever idea. So the essentially core of each weapon will remain the same. It is this modular part, and then you can add a stock and the front part to this. And this was my sketch, and then you can see the final version with a little bit adjusted so you can see it better as the player, because these areas were very flat and hard to see, otherwise very small, so I made them a little bigger, and indicators and so on. These were the weapons that are in the game, so this central one is the most common one, and then the bottom one is just a concept at this moment, so you can see it's not textured or anything, but the shape is there, and I would also continue developing this. Then you have two options that you can use in the game, and they can work slightly differently, but the idea of having two modes for each weapon is the same. So you can see here they will be portrayed on the gun itself here, and also here on this pipe on the side, and then these little wires on the side would show it on this gun. On top of that, you have a companion bot. The bot serves mostly the function of holding the UI for the player and giving some more visual interaction with the world. So you have the screen on the back that when you're aiming, this bot will move to a position at the bottom right of the screen, kind of like an on-screen UI, but less intrusive, I felt, more part of the game. And you have these little icons that will show various modes of your player character, and you have an arm that you can see up here. It can expand and then heal the player and then go back in. You have a certain amount of charges for your heal, like a lot of other action games do these days. And that's visualized in these cylinders. And also you have the front part which can open, and then he can kind of absorb certain, when you defeat an enemy, you can absorb some currency, something like that. And this is then one of the screenshots in the game. This is basically the aesthetic I was going for. So all the UI is on screen. Then that leads into the next section, which was the player's ship. And I wanted the player to be almost like a bounty hunter, but basically a freelance spy, because that is part of my setting, that the world is dominated by mega corporations, and espionage, corporate espionage, has been privatized and become a kind of lucrative but dangerous business, almost like a bounty hunter in a more traditional science fiction setting. And so this is that player's ship, and the design needed to be compact enough to be feasible as a one-person craft, and also not make the landing zones in my levels very huge, but still be large enough to have a small cargo bay and a living compartment for the pilot, for the player. And so this is the design I came up with. It's inspired by marine life, so almost like a manta ray, something like that, with these sort of elegant tendrils that also imply some speed and agility. And the design language, this rounded aesthetic with these shapes, is reminiscent of what the player suit looks like. So if I go back to that, here you can see all those rings and those shapes, and the color language is very similar between the two. And additionally, the interior and the exterior had to be working, because I wanted the player to traverse from the inside of the ship to the outside without a loading screen. And so all the flaps and the landing gear, all this kind of stuff was designed to actually work. And then this is the interior. So you can see the ship. These are cross sections without the shell, and this is with the shell. So it is split in a front section and a back section. The front section has the pilot part, and then here is more of a living area. And then the back section is a cargo area with a airlock in between. So right in the middle here. And this area that's missing, that is like the bathroom module, which is very small, but there's some creative liberty here, I guess. And you can see all the different views. So when you go in through the back ramp and then go to the front cabin here, and underneath this walkway you have the bed, bunk bed, and then storage on the sides, this kind of idea. And in the side view you can also see up here there's space for the landing gear, and in the back here as well. And then this ramp will close as well, and it looks like this. On the left, these were initial sketches. You can see the shape is a little less elegant than here. It's more rounded at the end. And the engines also have a slightly different shape, but in general, the concept was there quite early for this design. And I think it worked surprisingly well. So initial block out here in Blender, you can see the choppy polygons I hate. And I like this idea of these trails. I thought that would make for a very strong image. So you can see here my sketch. And I think they do. So I tried this also in the engine here in an early version. But at the end I removed it because firstly, depending on the perspective, this gets a little weird towards the end. And also I thought it was strong enough as is. If I add some light here and some dense fog around these extensions, then I felt it was strong enough. It looked fast enough as it was. And here's the wireframe of the model. This is the small overview over the materials and textures. So at the bottom left you can see the texture density and the UVs. The shell is one material, so the entire outside, and it's mirrored in the middle. If you look carefully you can see it. And that is that part, so top and bottom, right, and some details. And then the interior is split, the front part and the back part, and each of those has their own materials. And my reasoning for that was that if you are inside, the camera will be much closer to the player and to the environments. And so I felt they needed to hold up and have enough detail from close up. So that brings us to the enemy design. And I started by defining some constraints, some design parameters when I came up with the designs. I wanted to avoid humanoid organic stuff, at least at first, because it felt easier to me to do mechanical designs that are more rigid and hard surface and don't have more difficult animations. And so here are 3 of the designs that I made. And they are a combination of the state of the technology of the world, so near future high tech with autonomous drones, and then combine that with the cosmic horror eldritch experiment from that research lab. So these all are a little bit corrupted by some weird stuff, and otherwise are mostly robot related shapes. So you have this on the left, we have some little bot a sentry that will hover just above the ground and can have different weapons on the sides. And then this top part can close and open depending on if you shoot the weak spot, which is these orange parts. It's the same in the back. And then the central part is a flying drone. This is just flipped. And they can have different modules at the bottom as well. And on the right is the first enemy I made, which is a shell, a spherical shell that can expand in all the 8 directions and expose the vulnerable core in the middle. So this is that bot that I made from all angles. And at the bottom we have different variations on the weapons that they can be equipped with. That was another big constraint that I put on myself, that I wanted the enemies to be modular and give them different weapons and use them in different situations, because it takes me a lot of time to make these assets and texture them and so on. So I had to be a little smart about reusing assets. And so you will see there's this one is some bullets. This one is more like a disc which can shoot some kind of expanding laser ring. Imagine almost like a wall coming out here. And these are some beam weapon. So there would be some kind of very visible beam here that the player has to jump over or avoid in other ways. This one holds missiles, so these would actually detach, and so he only has a limited ammunition, something like this, and they would track the player. Then the 5th version is more of a long-ranged version. And the last one has a kind of cross design that can shoot arcs, semicircles somehow, that can be vertical or horizontal, so the player can jump over or dodge to the side, something like that. And a similar idea for the drones. You have a regular version that has bullets that it shoots out the bottom, and then another version that shoots guided rockets, and one that shoots a laser to the ground, which will cause some expanding ring to spawn, and another version which shoots laser columns that chase the player. And these were more intended to be obstacles than enemies. So you would place these, and they're very slow moving, but they make the player have to watch their movement a lot, because they will zone and make certain areas dangerous. So you would combine them with other enemies that want to make the player move, and then these enemies would disincentivize the player to move, so they have to judge which one they want to take care of, and so on. And then this part on the left is actually just this part that I added to the bottom of the drone. But I thought it could also be used as some kind of static laser turret in the wall or something. And this is that expanding enemy. So you can see here how it will expand and expose the core that is vulnerable, and this sphere would damage the player, and so on. These are some sketches. This is the initial sketch for that dome bot that initially was more mechanical and had some weak spot so you would shoot this orange area with a one weapon mode, and then this weak spot would reveal itself, and you would have to change the weapon mode and then shoot the weak spot with that. But I thought it was a bit too logical, too technical, so I changed it to be a bit more creepy and added this face that I sculpted. And then these are the different weapons that I had thought up to add to the sides. These are some visualizations where you can see the top line shows the rocket drone and shooting rockets that would chase the player with a certain logic. And here is that dome bot and how you could shoot it. So you would shoot this and open the top, and so on. And the other enemies, so here the expanding rings and the columns that chase the player, and so on. For the drones, I thought they could also be used as a initially deactivated enemy. So you would have these kind of shelves or docking stations that are part of the building, and then the drones are deactivated inside, and then once the player does something, then they can activate, and on the way back you have to fight them. And of course there are more designs that I had in mind, especially for bosses and the later areas of the game, but this is as far as I got. I got these ones working in the game, and for prototyping it was enough. But this is something I would push a lot further if I were to continue on this project. I feel the enemies and the interaction with them is very important, and I would need to push that a lot more. This is the design of the surface level of the moon in the game, and I have plans for an underground area as well. And then the initial area where the player starts is a research station in orbit of this moon. So I wanted a self-contained level where the player would start and introduce the game to them and so on. And then they would land their ship, take their ship and land down here in the landing zone in this area, which is then connected to a more city area, like a hub. And this part is for food and water processing. And this is more like a production building. And then over here is the power plant, which you can imagine there will be solar panels here and a little mirror array in orbit that would channel the light to the space, and some generators. And then this area would be where the player goes down to the second half of the game, essentially. And there's some little underground connection between these areas as well. And what was very important to me is how would these things be constructed on this place, and how would the infrastructure work? So you can see, for example, for this area, I made these modules. You can see it's all hexagonal, and so the shape of the city can be adapted to the landscape and the roof as well. So these modules could be brought over to different planets, different locations, and established as required on site. And then all the places are connected with these highways so that the transportation of goods works. And there's the power plant, and you will see later I have the pipes going through with the power and water and so on to every location. So it seems at least plausible that these kind of things could have been built this way, and the materials that were used are modular and these kind of ideas. And to begin, when I made this, I started by having some design for the terrain shape with the locations. So this is based on a height map that I generated elsewhere and then brought the mesh into Blender. And then the first thing I had to do was reduce the density of the mesh. So I had this node setup in Blender that reduces the density based on distance to certain objects. So you can see here on a plane with the distance to this box. And I did the same thing for the actual terrain, but the reference was all these cutout shapes. So this is where the levels will be, and then the density of the mesh is reduced. It's static here. I don't do anything particularly clever, but it helps to make it runnable. And then I cut this level into slices, almost like a cake, as you can see. And the point of that was to optimize for frustum culling. So when you imagine you have your camera and it looks to the right here, then all these tiles that are clipping that view frustum are going to be rendered, whereas the ones that are out of view will be cut. So if you have these very long shapes, then the camera will almost always see a sliver of them, and it makes it harder to cull that piece out. So that's why I cut them in this way, and it works quite well. And for the terrain, for the texturing of this large terrain, I used various generated masks. So this ambient occlusion, you have some pointiness and erosion maps here, and then if you mix them together in a certain way, you can get a result that looks varied, even though these are all just tiling textures. And in the engine, it looks like this. So the UV projections just from the top, you can see some stretching, but it's not too bad. And I'm combining these different masks to decide where each material should be shown. So the material itself is tiling, but the variation is introduced with different maps. And on top of that, I have shader effects, like a distance-based blend. So you can see here it's much brighter than here. And also a Fresnel, so curvature-based blend to make the environment look more varied than it actually is. And in the far distance, this is just rendered on a cylinder. This is another shot which doesn't have the environment, so you can more clearly see what's going on. The tiling, if you look carefully, you can see how it's tiling, but just by how the materials and the maps work together, it doesn't look unrealistic or repetitive, in my opinion. Then this is the first area that the player goes to. It's a research station in the orbit of that moon. And the research station itself consists of multiple of these modules. They're quite repeating the same, very standardized. And this module itself has a logic where the different components of that are also modular. So a very systematic way to approach it. My general design philosophy for the environments and for the world was that how would you actually build these places? If you considered it were real, you need to move all these things there so they can only be a certain size, and you need to have certain modularity for repairability and also expandability. So those were the things that drove my designs in a way. So this is another image where you can see this research station now from a different view has modules inside that can be removed, like this one, and replaced with different ones. So each of those can have a different layout where maybe you need a big space for engineering or more office space or whatever it may be. This was the design process. You can see it here a little bit better, that in this drawing, this first sketch that I did, we have a side view here where you see this dark orange line is the cut line basically of the shell. And this is from the frontal view, and this is the top view. So you have this bottom area is a fly-through area where the ships would fly in and land and then later take off again. And then you need to go up and into the actual interior space. And on both sides you have a module that can be removed, kind of modular. And this is the front view it generates. I guess you can also see it on the side here on the right. the fly-in area, make it look like this is the area, the landing bay, and then up top is all the actual infrastructure. And on the very top we have a secondary small landing bay for escape capsules, these kind of things. And here you can see the side view. So I have about 5 stories in each of those modules and a little bit more on top, and then this area below. And the module itself looks like this, and the interior can be custom to whatever is necessary at the moment. And I also did this so that I can, in the game, eject one of those modules, like you see here, and then have the player travel there and have a nice view of this station, because otherwise you don't really see the full thing as I show it here. Because imagine you're the player and maybe you can see this little red ship here. That's where you would start, and then you get off the ship and explore the station, but you only ever see it from the inside out and not from the outside in. So I wanted to add that view, so I added this removed module here. These are some interior views. So the bottom part is of the landing bay. You can see for scale, that's the player ship. And then in the back there is where the player goes up. Oh, you can see it better here on the left. This is kind of the entrance area, and then you would go up, and then the 4 pictures on top show the interior. It's a little barren, there's not much decoration yet, or tables, these kind of things. But I think the mood and general feeling is there. And then this is one of those modules. So it has the 5 stories, very symmetrical, with this kind of iconic, I feel, iconic front. And from the inside, also quite nice view. And then the interiors can be different. So at the bottom you can see there's one version that has a central shaft that will go up and down, and you can play with this verticality. And other ones can be just continuous floors, or it could be entirely open, and imagine a big hangar where they're building some kind of robot, something like this is what I was imagining. Yeah, so this is the exterior shot. You have these side windows, and around the outside these are solar panels, and in between those dark areas they're basically windows to the inside. On the upper area, the bottom area is just structural, and underneath the landing bay here you would have the life support, some tanks, and so on. You can see it here. So imagine all these tanks and machinery down there, then the landing bay area, the module area with the staircases, and the central area would be some kind of common area. And then up top I imagine living area for the scientists working there, and then escape pods at the very top. Side view. So the modules would end about here and then go to the edge. So this view and this side as well. And top view. And the second area of the game is on the surface of the planet, and it is the landing zone. So after you leave the research station, which I consider somehow a tutorial level, then the game is supposed to open up a lot more. So you would do some task there, like disable the surface defenses so that you can land, because there were some automatic defense turrets that, like here, you can see there are some turrets here that would block the player from coming down initially. But then after you disable those, you can land. So there's a landing strip here, and then some parking areas, and you can see all these cargo ships here. And then this big building here is the lobby. So almost like an airport, where you would have some taxi area where the planes, or in this case the ships, can park and be loaded, and then an area where the people would come out. So you have 4 gates here, and on the right you have a passage that goes to the back of the area, which is more for cargo, and then administration and so on in this part, which I don't explore. So mainly the playable area would be in this back area, and the interior looks like this. So here on the left is where the people would go in. And this is also in the game. You would go in here and then have this interior space to explore, and you can continue on to the back here, which would lead to this city area. And then this back area here, which has more the cargo area, and an elevator here that would go down, and some connection to the outside here. And I always considered, where would the airlocks for these kind of places be? So for each entrance you have an airlock here, And for this bigger area, you need a small airlock for the people and a large airlock for those transports. This is the initial conceptualization phase. So you can see this was my drawing. It's a little stubbier here. In the end, it turned out it was necessary to make it much larger, much longer. It also looks more elegant that way. And this is then the current state of it. So textured and so on. And then from above, it looks like this. And again, here are those power lines that I was talking about earlier that then go through to the power area, which would be somewhere over there. And then here you can see again how I thought about the pressurized areas where the airlocks would be and so on. These are shots from the inside of that lobby. You can see these airlocks. The doors currently are not working, so you would imagine those are closed. And then you would go in and some kind of animation with a particle effect, and then you can continue to walk in to one of these areas. And then if you continue up, so you can see left here, you would come up here into this big lobby. And if you want to continue back towards the city area, you need to go through a security, which is this kind of area, almost like a real airport. You have different views that are sketched and then try to mimic in my 3D environment. I wanted to play with verticality here and have those walkways, and imagine you have some enemies over there and you can go up here and have some combat or gameplay across these things and up and down, this kind of idea. These are some sketches of when I designed it, and a vending machine that I had a lot of fun designing. And in the game you can also interact with it and it shoots little cans out. Some more exterior shots. You can see the landing zone, this large area. You can actually traverse this. It's a little barren at the moment, but I thought it would add to the realism if it is possible to go there, and maybe I can hide some secrets there, who knows. And these are the transports that I designed, and then a container can fit perfectly inside, and inside those containers can be smaller crates and so on. And this is the inside. I wanted to try and tell the story to the player through these assets, through placing these assets and decorating this environment of what happened there before. So kind of imply that something has gone horribly wrong here, but it's not quite so certain what. And you don't really see any human corpses or whatever you may. So make it a little mysterious. Of course, there could be more assets, but I didn't have any more. So this is about as far as I got. And this is a shot from the back of the complex with that city area on the right. And then these two towers are that life support, food, water, treatment plant area. And I always try to include landmarks so you can find every place. So back here is another location, and this location you can see, and also this one has this tall tower, to make it always very obvious to the player the places they can go. This is a shot of the player ship landed with the nearby planet and another moon in orbit, the defense guns again. So that leads to the next area, which is the kind of city hub area where all the other areas connect to. At first, I needed to create a shell, basically, that holds in the atmosphere. So I used these energy barriers on this lattice structure that's very modular. Because again, I thought about how would these places be constructed. So I have you can see it better here. I have these modules, these hexagonal modules that make up the ground, and they can be lowered or raised when they're constructed, not during gameplay. And then add those modules that provide the shell, and essentially, if you wanted to, you could imagine how this could be expanded, or depending on the geography, this could have a different layout, but the idea could work on many different terrains. That was kind of the idea. And this area is not as developed as the landing zone, so you will see a lot of those gray blocks for the buildings and stuff, so it's totally not finished. But the idea and the layout is kind of there. And I wanted those kind of elevated highways that connect the areas also as a visual guide for the player on where they could go and how those areas should be connected. And this is that module I was talking about earlier. So you have those repeating modules that have almost like a cushion here, like a 2-layered roof, basically. For the interiors, I did some sketches over some base outline on where the elevations should change and where the buildings should be. So this in the back is the landing zone area, and you would come out here, and then how this big promenade would look with the buildings flanking it, and your view on how those highways would guide the view and so on. And so these are, I tried to get very similar shots of the realized versions and my sketches. So you can see it changed a little bit, but the basic idea is there, of this central promenade and kind of going down. And you can also see this here in the overview, maybe, I hope, that it's kind of going down and then going up again. So to get more of the city in view, I lowered the central part. And for this segment, I wanted to make all the buildings modular. So I built this set of components of walls and doors, and some of them are textured and some of them are not. And then built these buildings. So this building up here is entirely built out of these components. And for each asset, I used tiling materials combined with a vertex color multiplicative color. So you can see here, this is the vertex color just visualized. So you have obviously 3 colors for each point available. And then here is an asset that has these colors set. And so you can adjust these and use the same geometry with different colorings and different materials and create different assets that way. And of course, they all share a normal map. So there's a global normal map for the entire asset, and then individual normal maps for the materials, and then blend those together and multiply with the vertex colors, and then you can get some assets like that. And this is my block out of the scene. You can see here the verticality a bit more, and also all those assets in the level, and the block out of the different buildings. And I have begun to build these 3 buildings here. These are some shots of those. I think it kind of works. It's a little cluttered visually, but I think the direction kind of works. So not sure what I would do to change that, or if it needs change. Maybe the floor is a little too contrasty. But yeah, I think as a proof of concept, it works, using these tiling or repeating modular assets to create all these entrances and then the different facades. So you have this one and this one, for example, and it expands down here and so on. And then here we have some interiors which are not quite as textured, but I think they also make for a nice contrast. So you have the outside environment, which is more larger spaces between the buildings, and then interior, which has smaller spaces but a lot of views through the whole thing, and the camera gets a lot closer. This is the overview from above. So the playable area is larger than the first area here, the landing zone, but there's also a lot of more open area, just more distributed. So yeah, you have buildings, and then you have a bottom area which will have some more stuff. It's just blocked in right now. And then after somehow you get back up, you can go one of these 2 ways over, and you have some big central building that would have something in it. Yeah, so here another close-up of one of the buildings I designed for that. And you see the verticality that I can get out of those modules that make up the ground. And then the interior is all connected, so I have entrances here and here, and I try to mark them with those red lights. And you can go in and go to all the floors and on the top. And all these windows, I used 2 materials for it. So there's an outside which is dark like this, and from the inside, if we go back here, the inside looks like this. So you can see out, but you can't really see in. And connecting to the city area, if you go this way, we have the, I call it life support, but essentially it's the food and water treatment plant. So you would have these large towers, which are basically vertical farms. So you have imagine some vegetation in there, maybe some protein farm, imagine some bugs in some tubes or something. And then these big tanks that have some water processing, and everything is connected through these big pipes, which I thought made for a really nice visual. And of course, the infrastructure has to be connected with some kind of transportation idea. This is another shot. And then I had an idea for the background of my game where the world is dominated by large mega corporations. And so the food production has been taken over by one corporation that is almost like a religion, so that I could introduce more decorative and more ornamental elements into the design of these places. So I imagine that if you want to make some sort of expansion in space, some base, you need to get permission from this corporation that is responsible for the food production to have their staff there somehow, their production to make the food, basically. They have this technology and you want that, so you need to somehow please them. And so they basically want almost a temple complex for their food production. So you have this literal temple down here, which is the entrance is to the underground area, which I will get to in a moment. And then you have those large monumental statues that represent certain things. So the guy on the left would be somehow the fertile ground and soil that is necessary to make plants grow and so on. And then on the left you have some fertility statue that needs to be supported by the fertile ground, something like this. And maybe these little areas down here would actually have real soil brought from Earth that those statues would be in. Something like that was my idea. And mostly it started with this visual, with this idea to make this prominent visual that shows kind of the ridiculousness of this whole situation, that why would you go to some place in space on some faraway planet and you have to bring those huge monumental statues and the temple there just to respect this company because their belief or their religion is basically their way to dominate this industry. Something like this was my concept. And I quite like the aesthetic that came out of that. So yeah, you can see here my initial sketch, then some block out, and then how it looks like in the game in the end. Of course, this is not finished, but yeah, it's a pretty decent block out. Yeah, some more layout views with those big pipes. And I adjusted these pipes and added them also as a way to control the walkable area for the player. So trying to somehow confine the player to this area makes a somewhat natural barrier to the outside, because I tried to reduce the amount of invisible walls or these kind of things if possible. So that was one other idea I had for that. And here is a very early test just with a simple gray material for scale, where I tested those statues and I think the appearance is quite striking. And also from the interior of the tower, these huge faces, quite imposing. And then this temple, which somehow leads to the underground area, these big pipes. And this is the facade of the tower from sketch to final. And it lost a bit of its slimness, mainly so that I have more area inside to make the levels. So part of this area, the plan of this area is, if I go back to this here, as you can see, this temple has these kind of pipes, these lines, power lines coming from it. And essentially the door is locked and you somehow need to unlock it. So each tower would have the locks to one of the sides. So you need to traverse the tower, go up, and then do the other side, or maybe climb over this arm and then do the other tower in a different order, whatever you want. And then you can unlock and progress, something like that. So I wanted enough space inside the towers to put actual levels, basically. And these are some shots from the interior for the more final version. So this is more on the ground level, where you have this kind of loading area again, because you somehow need to transport the food, and that was always kind of pretty important to me, that at least the impression that it's somewhat realistic that these things can work, maybe, at least. Yeah, and here we have some interiors with this concrete structure that supports the tower, and the views that emerge there, also the infrastructure you can see, and how I designed that, and in scale with a person, how you would go up, and somewhere you need to solve the airlock again, so there's some area in there that I considered that. And these views of those big statues on this strange environment. And then we have the more underground area. So after you unlock the temple doors, you can go inside, and so this area here is then up here, if you can see that, where the temple is. So you have all this underground area that then at the end will connect to the next area, basically. And inside, it also has this religious idea, and on top of that, the idea of this maybe somehow religious decadence or corruption, if you want. So you would have maybe here would be some kind of luxury offices for the people that the delegation that moved to that colony, and then this big room, which you can see in these next 3 images, is essentially the storage for the seeds. So these big boxes would be like steel coffins that have the refrigerated frozen seeds in there. And then there's another way, if you see this other big area back here, that would be where the embryos for the livestock, for example, would be, or the eggs or whatever it may be. And yeah, you would have this gameplay around these different levels and all these rooms, which are just blocked in here. And I tried to create a part of it, a segment, in these bottom right 2 images with modular assets. So this is kind of how the interior would feel and how I would build out this environment. And I just didn't get to finish it, but I did a part of it at least. Yeah, and this is kind of the impression when you're there with the scale of these things and so on. Some more impression with the pipes that would have the water running and the maybe nutrient paste or whatever dystopic thing you can imagine. This part is about the materials that I created. And in general, there are 2 ways I textured the assets. So for the larger assets, I used tiling textures that I made in Substance Designer. And I have this set, you can see a sampling of them here. I have concrete and rock and different types of steel and panels. They would be reused and modulated using shaders. I have random maps that would modulate the color of these materials and the offset depending on where the asset is in the world, which only works with some materials, not with these that have a strong pattern, of course. And so that's how I textured the world, the environment. For the individual assets, like here for these crates, I just texture them in Substance Painter, so they have individual textures. But once again, I use the shader code to change the appearance of them. So all these boxes share the exact same shader. There's a multiplier for the color based on the position on the map. So just to give some more variation to it. And in this material I didn't, but for example for these cans, they also all share the same material. But I used some mask to only make this white or here light blue area different for each can. So yeah, so I can selectively make variations, or for the whole thing, whatever works for each asset. And the idea also with these tiling materials is to make as much variation with as little work as possible, because I am just one person and it takes a lot of time to create all these materials. And so I try to optimize that in a certain way. And the materials themselves are very straightforward. So here you can see it's a PBR workflow. You can see the albedo channel here. Roughness and metalness are combined in one map. Then we have a normal map and occasionally emission as well. And this is like a close-up, what that looks like. Just applied. This section is a small showcase of the different UI elements I made. So this is the logo and also the splash screen on the start. It has some animation as well that I made in shader code. And then this is the title screen. So you just have the settings on the side, the logo here, and the player ship here. And you can rotate this around. So if you click and drag your mouse, you can move the view. which I thought was quite cool, and I wanted something that would move on its own. So if the person starts the game and then they don't do anything, it's not just a static image, but there's something happening. Those asteroids also moving by are controlled in code. Here are some more UI views. So this is the setting dialog on the main menu, the loading screen, which has different images, but this overlay is always the same. And then some inventory screen where these are Blender renderings that I made for each item. Some more settings, different dialog at the different location where you can level up. These are using some formulas to calculate the next level and the damage and so on. Transportation section, which maybe should have these a little bit grayed out if they're not active, but that's the idea, that you can, at some point, once you visited a location, you can teleport there. And so you have this overview and description, which I didn't do yet, for each area. And this is the on-screen view. So when your health is very low, there will be an overlay that you can toggle if you don't like it. And your health cylinder thing is very red at that point. And then this is the death screen. And this section is a bit more about the process of making the game. So I implemented some profiler, which was fundamental in getting the performance to a reasonable place. So I have some logic that will time each function call every frame, the ones that I want to time. So you can see here, these are all the functions that I wrote, not the go.built-in ones. I didn't touch those. These are basically just the ones that I wrote. And I'm timing them from start to finish, and how many hits there are, and of those functions, like how often they get called, and the maximum and the average and so on. And then at the bottom, I visualize that. So you can see this is a rolling buffer, basically, and these gray lines indicate the current frame. And then this will move forward. So the next frame would be on the right and just overwrite this existing one. And the different function times are plotted down here, and the colors correspond. So you can see this top call is the one that has most time, and it's the one that peaks the highest. And this black area is showing the budget for each frame. So if I want to run at 60 frames per second, then this top line is 16.67 milliseconds, and all my calls are down here, so we are perfectly in budget. Of course, on top of that would be the renderer and whatever the engine itself is doing. This is mostly for profiling CPU code. And up here is a little log about the saved data and so on. And then this middle area is also quite interesting. The entire level that we're in, so this landing zone area, is divided into squares, into zones. So you can see them all here. And only 4 of them are active at a time. And by active, I mean that all the objects and enemies and so on in those tiles are updated more frequently than the ones outside to save on performance on calculations. And this blue one is where the player is in, and then these lighter blue ones are the 3 closest ones. So basically, if the player moves from this corner of this tile to the bottom, then those 4 would be active, if that makes sense. And this is just a visualization to see how that works. Yeah, this is just a close-up of this. And you can see for a smaller area, there are less tiles, but it's the same idea. In this last section, I will show a brief overview of the development progress. So from the very beginning to the very end, what I implemented in what order. So the first thing I did, you can see at the top, was a small test level with this character I modeled and textured as a test to see, firstly, if I could, and then what it would look like in the engine, how it would perform, these kind of things, because this was the first time I used Godot. So this was the very beginning of 2023. And then I have this then I have this texture that just shows, gives you some orientation. And then I need to do the character controller. So if you move the mouse, how the camera will move, and the player, and that the camera doesn't clip through the ground, these kind of things. And then in the next step down here, you can see, I don't know if you can see, I have some type of weapon included, so you can shoot, which will be the basic mode of interaction with the world. and so on. And the last step of this first phase was to try and create a few assets to get a feeling for what it could look like, what I can do, and how much time it will take for creating this type of look. So this was done within a few days. I made a few materials and a few simple assets with an environment, and this background is my first attempt at an HDR creation in Blender. I just rendered that out and then put it in the engine. And so this was the proof of concept, basically, that told me that it could look good, can perform well, and I can actually do those things at the level that I want. So in the next phase, here, I continued that and basically focused on enemies and how the player would interact with the world. So you can see at this top picture, I created these big rockets that would chase the player and that you can shoot, and then they will explode, and all these kind of interactions. And you will also see down here I have this idea of the different guns and the heat instead of ammunition, this concept that I talked about in the player character section. This I tested out here. And then I made some other enemies, so these guys would basically chase the player. It has very simple, stupid logic, so if there's a wall in between, they will not go around or something like that. Very simple. Similar down here, there are those enemies that will chase the player in 3 dimensions somehow and collide with the world. These kind of tests. And some platforming, all those things I tested in this phase. Then after that, I started to introduce these navigation maps and made the enemies a little bit smarter. So you can see here they can go up this ramp and follow the player. And then I also introduced this enemy that you have seen before that will expand and chase the player. And this is some kind of damaging sphere. And then started to play around with shaders. So the first shader that I made was actually this one for this expanding sphere. And it's animated and things are moving around. And I put a test character in to change the height, because that actually made a big difference. Before I was playing with this tiny character, and now if you want a human-sized person, then it feels quite different. After that, I tried to make an actual level, my first attempt at an actual level, and this, in the end, this got scrapped, but this was my testing ground for some modular level approach. So these are just simple modules I did. I had interactive doors. I had enemies that chased you through those doors, and the doors would open when the enemies chased. And these turrets will shoot at the player and track and so on. And this last picture shows the kind of atmosphere I had at this point, which I thought was really working from a purely visual and atmospheric point of view. But it was very difficult to play because I had this extreme blackness and these harsh lights, and also the enemies were just these very saturated, simple shapes of pure red color. So it was it needed some work, but the concept was working at this point. That was quite nice to see. So this next section is basically refinement. You can see that I started to introduce some different lighting effect that has more ambient light, so the blacks don't go quite as dark as before, and there are some more effects like those reflections, and the background has more detail with all these asteroids as well. And I also started to be more precise in my code and introduce debugging tools, like you can see here, the raycasts and the impacts and so on, where those happen and where the hitboxes collide, these kind of things. And also the enemies got some smarter behavior. They got a state machine and behavioral tree for each different behavior they have. In this, the paths are previewed, for example, so you would have some pre-calculation of different paths the enemies can take, and then you will see like where they end up and so on, and what kind of things they do along the way. So that was a big part of this area, to give me these tools so I can continue developing various designs. And also I started to run into performance problems, of course. And here you can see some test when you make those drones that will shoot a lot of bullets and create all those donuts, those expanding laser waves, the way I was doing it, which is what I saw online, was not particularly efficient. Essentially continuously creating new objects and then destroying them and updating them in very inefficient ways. But at that time I didn't know. So this was the big issue at this time. And I started to implement some clever ideas, like trying to stagger the updates of the enemies and limit the amount of bullets that can be fired by having some kind of budget that the enemies would request some tokens that they can then use to use one of their abilities and so on. And those ideas were good, but there was a more fundamental architectural issue with the engine at this point that I will address later, and you already saw in the profiling sections. But for now, this next section after that was the creation of the actual game world. So here you can see the first prototypes of the geometry of the terrain, generated from a height map and then decimated and brought into the engine. And I also introduced the ship, which here is not textured yet, and the camera view and the character. All these things are starting to look much closer to a final result. And I started the UI, because before that I didn't have any, and I introduced loading, saving, and options, all these kind of things, and that they get stored and loaded. And after that, here you can see this is the first version of the debugging profiling UI. And this is when I realized that all those calls I was making earlier in the enemy code were not particularly performant. So my recommendation for anyone who wants to do this themselves is try and get those tools up as early as possible and be certain of what your code actually does and how much performance it requires and so on. So that's really helpful. If you don't know what to optimize, then you can only guess, and that generally doesn't solve the problem. And I also, in this part, also started working on the materials. So you can see this vertex color blending and tiling materials approach I was talking about earlier. You can see it here. This is basically where I started with that. And I added more effects and interactables, like these exploding boxes and enemies and so on. So all this kind of stuff happened here. And further developed this idea of the removing the UI from the screen and onto the elements of the world. So everything onto the character and the bot, or as a screen effect. So when you get hit, you have this screen effect. It's just a post-processing shader. And that leads to the state of the game is in now. So everything that I showed in this video is the result of about a year and a half of work. I think it's pretty good for what it is. It's obviously not a finished game. And yeah, let's see. Maybe at some point I'll come back to it. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.